Amitabh did his postdoctoral studies at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, USA. He joined DuPont in 2007 and has been on the forefront of development of cutting-edge technologies such as genome editing. He served on several leadership roles, including the chair for the Site Leadership Council at DuPont and most recently site leader for DuPont's Pioneer Group at the DuPont Knowledge Center. Next to Amitabh is Professor Suresh Subramani. He received his PhD from University of California, Berkeley. He joined faculty at UC San Diego in 1982 and has been there for 37 years. An outstanding molecular and cell biologist, he was the Executive Vice Chancellor of UC San Diego from 2010 to 16. Currently, he is the Global Director of the Tata Institute for Genetics and Society, which is spread across UC San Diego in US and at INSTEM Center in Bangalore, part of the NCBS campus. He holds the Tata Chancellor's endowed professorship in molecular biology at UC San Diego. So this is the panel in front of you, and we are going to talk a little bit about science in agriculture. And as you know, like we are everybody when talks about India, we talk about a population base in billions, but by 2050 we will have 1.7 billion people, accelerating the demand for food by 70% from where we are today. We are proud to be self-sufficient in grains. We have achieved significant food security over several years, but our agricultural productivity remains very low. Almost 80% of our farmers are small and marginal farmers. Our agricultural practices are extremely resource intensive. We are very cereal centric. As Sanan in one of the discussions mentioned to me that we don't export food, we actually export water. And we have serious issues with sustainability of our agriculture. So while we have issues in agricultural productivity, we also have issues on sustainable agriculture and how can recent advances in science and technology help improve our agricultural productivity, improve the food security, nutrition security, as well as make it significantly sustainable as we get ready for a much larger population that is going to be dependent upon agriculture in India. So with that, I would start asking my first question to Shannon. And Shannon, you have been a naturalist, you have been working on the intersection of ecology and agriculture, you have been in India for quite some time now, especially, what according to you are the challenges of agriculture in India, especially considering the role of our, ecosystem for sustainable agriculture?
So I want to start by thanking you, Manoj, for moderating this and for inviting me, and also to the organizers. It's a great honor to be here, both with my fellow panel members who are very distinguished, but also in part of this really interesting intersection of a lot of different fields together. So I also want to say it's just really a great thing for me to be able to talk about this issue. It's something that is very dear to my heart. Even after all these years, I still get asked why I'm in India. And I'm actually really here to really share this ecological temperament and try to stimulate that in this country. And I'm a first-generation college student. I grew up working on a farm. I grew up milking cows and feeding pigs and all of those things in a very rural, poor area of the United States. So agriculture has been with me my whole life. It was the school I went to at Cornell was the ag school, and so I've been really thinking about this a lot. And when we think about ecology and how ecology interfaces, so ecology, the root of that is oikos, right? So oikos is also the root for the word economics as well, and it loosely means household, right? And when we think of a household, we think of, well, it means the people in the household, it means the furniture in the household, it means the house itself, it means the food in the household, it means everything organized around that environment. And that's very, very relevant for agriculture as well. Agriculture is not something that we can think of in terms of the crops or the livestock or the farmer or the consumer or the market. It's actually all of those things put together. So I often hear, why are you thinking about ecology with agriculture? And ecology is thought of in terms of maybe wildlife or biodiversity, but ecology is a much more basic concept. It's the idea of interactions of organisms. And that is inherent to all things when we think about it, is how organisms interact, including how humans interact, how plants and animals interact, how we interact with our environment around us. And it's not often thought of when we talk about agricultural solutions. There are a lot of solutions in existence for sustainable agriculture, for productive agriculture across the world, many of which we'll talk about today in this panel in terms of genetic technologies, also in terms of ICT technologies, better data management, conservation agriculture, agroecology. All of these things actually exist, and many of them have existed, like conservation agriculture has been around for 50 years. But we often don't talk about these things together. And that actually can cause some pretty interesting problems, that many of which are actually really big issues in today's news. So one that I'm sure you're aware of is with our banana crop in the world, right? Bananas are very genetically similar across the world. They're this Cavendish variety, and it's really susceptible to this Fusarium wilt disease. So it's actually threatening to wipe out our entire world's crop of bananas, which is the most popular fruit across the world. India actually has a lot of varieties of banana available. We actually grow a lot of different kinds of banana across this country. So having a better handle of the genetic diversity that India has can help identify traits, identify new genetic bases to actually create resistance to these crops. Another example that actually happened in my home country in the US has to do with the Monarch Butterfly. So one of the great innovations that came from using Roundup Ready soybeans and corn, which were herbicide resistant, and they became very popular because of their value to farmers. But with that came a huge increase in herbicide use. And the herbicide not only then affected the weeds in the fields, but it also affected the milkweed, which is the host of the monarch butterfly. So the monarch butterfly population in the United States has dropped precipitously. And all of these things can be thought of not only in terms of the technologies, but also the relationship of these technologies with the ecosystem, with farmers' needs, with the market needs. So I think that this is something that's desperately needed, not only in India, but across the world. And I would, rather than waxing poetic, I'd like to offer maybe 3 very specific ways that we can address it, because I rarely get this opportunity. So one, I think, is that we have to think about ways to adapt these technologies that we'll talk about today, but also better sustainable practices to the ecological regions of India. India has 20 recognized agroecology regions. They're very diverse in terms of their soil, in terms of their habitats, even in terms of the people that live in those regions. They're not based on state lines, they're not based on language lines, they're based on ecological lines. We need to have a much better understanding of what's there, not only in terms of the plants and animals that we use for our food, but also in terms of the biodiversity that's existing in that region. We need to have a better idea of the climate, the soil characteristics, the microbes. All of this needs to be much better documented, and it's simply not well documented for any ecological region in this country. That needs to be first and foremost if we're going to be able to adapt these technologies. And secondly, we need to increase an awareness in the people of India, and that includes not only from the scientist perspective. Not only do we need to discuss better with the public, but we need to listen to the public. Farmers need to talk to scientists, give them ideas on what they need, what they're facing in terms of threats. We need to take their rights, especially women's rights, because most women are farmers are women nowadays in India. We need to work better with NGOs. NGOs need to work with farmers, work with scientists, and also work with the government and the policymakers as well. We need to have a much better dialogue across those. And I'd like to see us all sitting at the table together making these decisions, not scientists making science answers and farmers making farmers' rights, but actually us working together. And finally, I think when it comes to adoption, this really has to then happen holistically. It can't happen top down. You can't just drive into the market the way agriculture needs to happen. It needs to happen from both sides. Farmers need to have a vested interest in that. They need to have a feeling that their voice is being heard, that the market needs to be paid attention to in terms of subsidies and MSP and other issues that are very real issues in today's agriculture. All of these things need to be thought about. So this is something that I'm really passionate about, and I would urge actually the members of this audience, if you work in robotics, if you work in IT, if you work in cell biology, you actually have a role to play in the agriculture of this country, and I would urge you to get involved and think about this, because I think India has to work together, and I think all the solutions exist in this country if we just work together on them. So,
thank you, San, and thanks for highlighting the role of ecology in agriculture and the close relationship between the two, and then taking it to the relationship between a farmer and science, and that that leads me to the second question to Amitabh. I'm sure with your research experience, with your leadership experience in industrial players like DuPont, you would have interacted with farmers, in the agriculture sector a lot. So, what according to you, are what we can do to establish a closer relationship between science and farm, if I can say, because when you're talking about science and society and then specific area of agriculture, how do we bring farm and science together?
First of all, good morning everyone. Welcome to this session, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me for this particular session. So, it's not a good place to be a farmer today, especially in this country, right? It's a fact. Why? What are the challenges? I think the topmost challenge that we have in the country in terms of agriculture is the land holding. Average size of land holding is 1.2 hectares. Majority of it is less than 0.5, right? And it is getting divided. You know how the practices are, father has 3 sons, it will be divided into 3, maybe 1 daughter, 4. So after 2 generations, it's going to be there is hardly any land, right? And to have any intervention, these are pretty small. So land holding is a big challenge. Now next, look at the next problem. Input quality. Having good quality seed, good quality fertilizer, that's not easy, right? Move to the next one, which is weather. And I think today one of the biggest challenge, as Professor VijayRaghavan mentioned, climate is changing. Whether you believe it or not, climate is changing, right? We see rapid fluctuation in the climate. So we need to provide the farmers with climate smart seed so that they can get the produce. In addition to the food security, nutrition security is also a big challenge for the country, right? World is moving towards completely, there is a dramatic shift in the thinking of people. For example, meat is a polluting industry, one of the most polluting industries. So the Western world is moving towards plant-based meat, right? So I think today, tomorrow is going to be the trend in the country as well. So there are opportunities there. Now let's look into what farmer faces before what are the solutions that we have. Today, the agriculture in the country is more about supply driven, not about demand driven, right? So a farmer decides to plant a seed based on last year's information, right? So tomato was selling well, price was good, you go. When he goes to market, what he says? That there are 300 other farmers who have grown tomato because the price was good last year. Now in the market, the price is low. It's 2 rupee per kilo. His input cost is 6 rupee per kilo. So what he's going to do? Now let's look at the next challenges that is there. We produce quite a bit of food, but a lot of food is wasted. About 30% of the food is wasted. And also this has to look at this has to do with the practice as well. For example, when you go to buy banana, we try to buy banana which is doesn't have any mark on it, right? If there is a small mark, we don't want to use it, which leads to huge wastage of food. One side there is a huge scarcity of food, the other side there is a huge wastage. So what science can do, right? Science has a big role to play. So for example, as I said, one of the tough part is that the land holdings are small. So having intervention which are easy to do in a larger holding. For example, United States, the average land size is about 10 to 15,000 acres. Go to Brazil, about 15 to 20,000. So you can do like these practices, and be effective. It is not that easy to do it in India. For example, doing precision ag is in India is going to be extremely challenging because of the land holding. Having said that, can you get a better quality seed with genome editing coming from CRISPR-Cas? Of course we can, right? Can you provide quality seed which have been done in such a way that the seeds are able to withstand the drought conditions in the field better? Yes, we can. Do we have those technologies? Yes. What is needed to be done is that, for a country point of view, we need to have competency development as well as capacity development in these areas, right? I'll give you an example. The traditional transgenics, there has been reports that it takes $130 million to deregulate one event. So if you want to come up with a solution which is global, $130 million. Whereas, and it takes about 12 to 13 years to commercialize something, right? And please remember this, we are talking about in a predictable environment. If the environment is not predictable, you can think about how long it takes. Whereas some of the modern technologies, for example, CRISPR-Cas, can allow you to do that in a much shorter time frame, 5 to 6 years, and less than $10 million. So this opens up opportunities for Indian academia, small companies, to be at the forefront of science, which we could not do earlier because we didn't have that economic power. So I think the need of the hour is that, we integrate this, they look at the farming needs and how technology can enable, and we have to think from the point of view from the farmer, what is that we can do to make them more effective, and there are a lot of solutions. So as I said, climate smart seed, using biologicals for improving productivity, right? Downstream, weather predictions, even predicting what kind of projections for the market for the next year. If the farmer has access that this is the food crop which is going to be demand next year, he's going to go and plant that crop instead of what has been the one in vogue for the last year. So I think science and technology has a big role to play, and there are technologies available. There are opportunities for the country to take it forward, and we need to be standing to the farmers, next to the farmers. Farmers have ushered the green revolution. Today we are sufficient in food because of the great work that has been done by the farmers, but they won't be able to do it tomorrow because land is getting more toxic because of the inputs that have been put for improving productivity. The production has gone down, the productivity per se has gone down, and that's what technology can play a big role.
Thank you, Amitabh. So thanks for highlighting the need to respond to climate change by having better seeds which can withstand the climate risk, highlighting that the weather risk management and information availability to the farmers itself is a great area, market risk and exposure to information, but most importantly, the new advances in areas like genetics, which could help improve agri productivity, nutrition security and food security at a smallholder farm level, right? We're not going to see any consolidation going forward. So how do we make farming exciting and really valuable for these 80% of our farmers who are small and marginal farmers, right? Without really disrupting their quality of life and their land ownership. So this leads me to the next question to Suresh. And Suresh, as an eminent researcher in life sciences, you have seen evolution of genetics over the last 30 odd years. What do you think that all these recent advances in active genetics and gene drive research, would have some applications for agriculture and eventually help us get some value to the farmers in the new science and technology? Suresh leads Tata Institute for Genetics and Society, and he's actually working in this space. So very relevant and I would say a timely question for you.
Well, thank you, Manoj, and thank you for my fellow panelists for this opportunity to talk to you about what I think is a national crisis in food security. So you heard about the population challenge, you heard about the land holdings, but there are additional issues here, and that is that as climate change predicts greater periods of drought, we will have a scarcity of water. all middle class or those who are able to afford have the resources want organic farming. They don't want pesticides in their foods. You also have India spending less than 0.3% of its GDP in agricultural R&D. And this is all at a time when we are also exporting, and part of our economic growth is that we're exporting fruits and vegetables to the rest of the world. And as I mentioned to a small group yesterday, I heard from Amitabh that to export 1 kilogram of basmati rice, we use 6,000 liters of water. So essentially, we're exporting water to other countries as we sell basmati rice. So this is actually precipitating, in my view, a national crisis in food security, because by the time 2050 arises, we will have risen to 1.7 billion and many mouths to feed. And so this also affects the ecology and the environment. So this is really something that we need to put our heads together to try and tackle now, because none of these solutions or disruptive change doesn't happen overnight. I can think of a lot of easy wins and incremental things. For example, you can optimize every aspect of the farm to market value chain with technologies that exist now, including digital technologies, sharing of information, etc. But those would be incremental changes. And what you heard Amitabh Khan and Vijay and others talk about are we need disruptive changes, and this is what I want to address today. So, we have for 12,000 years been doing agriculture, doing plant breeding and so on, and you heard Amitabh talk about the fact that it takes 7 to 12 years to develop a new variety of crops, and this is with improved techniques in agriculture and plant breeding, and we've learned a lot and come a long way. But what we now need is something that is really very disruptive, and this is the change I'm going to talk about. This is change that has happened really in the last 7 years or so. It is in its infancy, and it needs to grow, and one needs to experiment with this technology to see what its full potential might be. And I'll just draw your attention quickly to the fact that I grew up during my postdoctoral days and so on during the birth of recombinant DNA technology. It is a field where there were a lot of fears in the beginning, and those fears were mitigated, and people did experiments carefully. It's taken a good 30 years to yield a potential today. In 2021, the biopharmaceutical industry will be valued at $292 billion. So think of what was there 30 years ago. And almost every new pharmaceutical company is not looking at small molecules anymore, but using macromolecules. And this is the time it takes for new technology to mature. And it needs an ecosystem, as you heard Kiran, Mazumdar, and others talk about, to sustain such technologies, to bring them to fruition. So what is it that this technology is? So this is the CRISPR-Cas9 technology. I will just very quickly run through it for those who are not familiar with it. Essentially, CRISPR can be viewed as a cursor in your word processing program. You can place the cursor anywhere in the genome of any organism to decide that's where you're going to try and make a gene edit. And molecular scissors called Cas9 and related enzymes allow the DNA to be cut there with a double-stranded break. Such breaks are lethal in all cells, in all biological systems, but we have wonderful repair systems that put these things together back, mostly with great fidelity, occasionally with small errors, a small frequency of errors, and that can be called insertions or deletions or indels. But at the same time, you can use the same technology after you place a break to now introduce foreign DNA into that point, which gives you a transgene or transgenic organism, which allows you to modify the genome of existing organisms, whether they're plants or animals or bacteria, to get these gene edits. Now, about this whole technology of using CRISPR-Cas9 was developed by Jennifer Doudna at UC Berkeley and Feng Zhang at MIT in 2012. And by 2015, it was known that in about 20 different cell types, such gene edits could be created, and this was wonderful. This included plants. But then a transformation happened, because in 2015 and 2016, it was shown that this could be transmitted through the germline to completely turn upside down on its head the laws of inheritance that we have known for 150 years, given to us by Gregor Mendel with his experiments on peas. And all of you will understand, whether you're a biologist or not, that diploid organisms inherit traits from two parents, and there's a 50% chance, since we have a chromosome from each parent, that there would be a 50% chance of a given trait being inherited in the first generation, and then in the next generation it's going down to 25%, then 12.5%, so it gets diluted out in the population, unless over evolutionary time this is selected for and maintained in the population. So traditional genetics, as we know it, gives rise to interesting variation in traits, but they get diluted out and selected over evolutionary time. With this CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, you can create an edit and have 100% of the progeny inherit that, so you completely violated all of the rules of standard genetics. To now you come to a point where you can keep that trait, whether it's desirable or not, whether it's harmful or beneficial to the organism, you can maintain that in the population. And this brings me to the point that Amitabh was talking about, where it takes 7 to 12 years to create plants by traditional genetics. You can now direct and edit exactly where you want it in the genome of any plant precisely. And this gives you a variety of advantages. You're no longer restricted to the natural variation that occurs in the population. You can create new variations that didn't exist before in nature, so you can experiment and explore and select. You can also do this traditionally when you have a mutation that is created by traditional genetics. What happens is that there may be associated linked or genetically linked traits that are detrimental. So you try and have to breed this thing or by backcrossing it into the normal populations so that you get pure populations with the desired trait. And sometimes that you pay a price for that. You bring in unnecessary traits that you cannot delink from the desired trait that you want. The gene editing technology allows you to make the precise edits precisely where you want it. You can also do this in a way that you leave no scar behind. That is, you can take the process through, and in the process you might use tools like CRISPR and Cas9, but by the time you're done with it, you can also discard them so that there's no sign of what tool you use. It is just a process that got you there to that point. So this now it takes you to the stage where you can do genetics in a new way that is that breaks the previous fetters that limited you, and to get new desired traits and experiment with systems and do this much faster, quicker, cheaper, and to do this also in a multiplex way. Rather than picking one trait at a time, you can tackle 5 or 6 traits or even deal with polyploid organisms. So rice is diploid, wheat is hexaploid, which complicates the genetics, but this CRISPR-Cas9 technology allows you to do this with polyploid organisms. So this has now opened a huge opportunity because it now changes the rules of the game. This is disruptive technology. It's in its infancy, but it needs to be allowed to grow and experiment. And of course, ultimately, before it is put to use for the benefit of society, one has to do this in a socially conscious manner and ethical manner, working with public policy and the regulators. And as Vijay has often pointed out to me, this cannot be just top-down, it has to be bottom-up. But at the same time, bottom-up means that one has to be able to take this to the farmer and demonstrate it in his or her backyard and show that this is really much more beneficial than what they were doing before. And so it has great potential. Let me just transition quickly to spending a minute or two on the regulatory aspects of this. This is new technology, so the whole world is now trying to debate what will be the rules and regulations and guidelines that govern the use of this technology. Of course, just as a hammer can be used for driving a nail into a wall, a hammer can be used to injure someone and for nefarious purposes also. So this, like most other technologies, has beneficial as well as adverse uses, and one has to be careful about how one uses it. But I think the government and the regulatory agencies have an important role to play. And I will just end this part by saying that there are two big players now. Europe defines genetically edited organisms and genetically modified organisms as one and the same. And even if the gene edit gives you the same thing that a natural variation created, it is called genetically modified. It's the process is what is being focused on in Europe, whereas in the US, it is the final product that matters. The process does not matter. And so they have just kept separate gene editing separate from genetically modified organisms. And India is now in the process of putting together panels to debate this and regulate this, and we hope that the policies will be chosen wisely, and people like Amitabh are members of that committee. And we will have to wait and see what the rules and guidelines will say, but I hope that in like everything that we do in life, you walk across the road, I could get hit by an auto rickshaw or a motorcyclist or a car. There's risk in everything that we do that is inherent. We have to weigh the cost versus benefit in everything that we do, and the context of the cost versus benefit might be very different in the US versus India, and we have to keep all of that in mind. But I think that with the wisdom that exists in India, with the talent that exists in India, we have a tremendous opportunity, not really in this case, to be world leaders, not followers, and to create this technology right here at home, and to use this for the benefit of society and ultimately for mankind. Thank you.
Thank you, Suresh. And every time I talk to Suresh and other life science researchers, I want to go back in time and study life science. I have wasted my life. Sometimes I think it was boring. When I grew up, studying biology was boring, so I didn't study biology because my brother was a doctor. I said, I don't want to do it, and now I want to go back in time. I want to study biology, and I'm reading actually. Suresh has recommended some books to me. So, those youngsters sitting, somewhere there, guys, please go into life science. It's more exciting than physics, chemistry, engineering, computer science, everything. It's really, really exciting. I can't even tell you, even the popular literature I am reading in biology, and I see myself doing some CRISPR-Cas and something like that. So, Suresh, thank you so much. But you know what? When this nuclear science was developing, the world was talking about nuclear energy, and the nuclear non-proliferation treaties were signed. We as a country, we left behind, right? At one point of time, we were running around the world for nuclear fuel and all that. We were not leading, the globe in nuclear energy. We should not miss that opportunity. Now there is another opportunity in life science. For a lot of people, it's about food security, healthcare. For me, it's about national security as well. I think this is one area that's emerging. China is taking a lead in this. US is taking a lead in this. Europe is running ahead of it. So I think we need to get our policy, quickly together on this aspect, and that leads to my next question. And I think we are good with time, so we'll take 2 or 3 minutes each, and so that we can open it up for some questions as well. So Amitabh, you sit on some of the government panels, right? And you have been working on new genetic technologies, and are you concerned with some of the calls from some sectors where, suddenly some activism starts and people start calling about this technology is bad, and GM is bad, CRISPR-Cas ban it, and all those kind of things. There could be political, or some pressure from vested interests against these new technologies till they are proven and implemented. Is there a prudent way to approach this?
So, it's a really great question, and I'm a scientist, right? So I go by evidence, right? So if the evidence is there against it, and I'll buy it. I don't go by emotion. So for me, I came back. I was a postdoc in Cold Spring Harvard lab, doing pretty well. I decided to come back, because country is very important for me. And I came back here, started working for this company. And one of my goal was that, can you develop tools and technologies from here, which we can apply, right? So of course, it's a multinational company, so a lot of it is for US, but a lot of the work was for India, focusing on India. Now, before answering your question on regulation, I would like to give one example for what country did. The country decided in '99 that we are going to join the RISE Genome Sequencing Consortium. That was the first time India as a country has joined a sequencing consortium or any scientific adventure of that nature, right? And today, and I was beneficiary of, thank you, Devati, for giving me the fellowship to go and learn sequencing, high throughput sequencing from Japan, came back, started the lab. Today, in the country, we have some of the excellent labs which are involved in sequencing. Today, we are thinking about participating in the Earth genome, which was not possible, if this excellence was not there. So, in order for us to be successful in CRISPR-Cas, we need multiple competencies, right? One of the competencies is, of course, the CRISPR-Cas technology, which is available, But in addition to CRISPR-Cas technology, we also need to have good genome sequencing technology, right? So, and information technology. So, India as a country is really poised to take over the advantage of it. So what needs to be done is now we need to have regulations which are science-based, predictable and time-bound, right? More importantly, I think science needs to go forward. See, whether we are going to have a commercial product which is CRISPR-Cas enabled, a farmer buying, I think that is secondary. We need to take this product to the field to show that, okay, this is effective or not, right? The farmers are one of the smartest breed that you can get. They are not going to buy a seed second year unless the seed is really good. I can tell you that from my experience. So what we need to do is look into this part from the regulation point of view that it has to enable the science to be taken care, right? Now what is happening in the world? Europeans have taken a very non-progressive view that they are going to regulate CRISPR-Cas like any GM technology. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, Japan, they have given clear, and US, they have given clear view that they are not going to regulate these as GM, right? India, fortunately, I think DVT has been at the forefront, and as Professor Subramani said, I am part of some of the committees. There has been some really progressive view, and the discussion that I have had there among the members of the committee has been pretty good. And I think, we are waiting for the final, the guidelines to come. I think this is going to be really science-based, progressive. This is not going to be what has happened earlier. So I'm pretty excited about it, where the country can go, with the right kind of enabling environment. And I'm so excited about this one. This is kind of a holy grail. When you are studying, doing PhD, doing postdoc, we wanted to have homologous recombination at a efficiency, which was a dream, right? In my time, in 3-4 years in the company, we edited more than 60 genes in rice, right? You want to make rice plant dwarf, it's just a matter of 6 months to make it happen. You want to make rice withstand drought, you can make it happen very quickly. So this technology is phenomenal. And now the power that technology has got unprecedented. I don't think anything, even if you compare it with traditional transient technology, this is unprecedented. So I think we have really great opportunity to go. I'm pretty happy about where we are going towards, but we need to have an enabling environment, and we need to discuss, and brings me to Shannon. We need to have discussion in the society, in the room, everywhere about the potential of this technology and also the challenges, right? And take it forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Amitabh. And that leads to another question to Suresh and Shannon, but I will give you 2 minutes each or less. And both on, taking these new technologies and deeper engagement with R&D. Do you think, both with your experience, Suresh and Shannon, that can we have some educational awareness, some outreach, so that there is we can reach out to the science and academic community, the student, but also to the wider population. So maybe Shannon.
So I think for me, when I think about this upcoming century, where we're having this massive transfer of our jobs, they're becoming automated, and our upcoming population is going to have to change the way it thinks about employment in this country. And one of the things that's really never going to be taken over easily, I think, by robotics, we can hear about that maybe later, is synthetic reasoning. It's something that's deeply human, being able to put things together. And my grandpa would call this common sense. And I think that is something that we desperately need to bring back to education in this country. I think that we don't teach our children anymore where their food comes from. We need to have gardens in every school. Gardens are something that you can have with almost no money. So there's not an excuse for any school in this country not to have a garden. And I think we worry a lot about teaching our children, the details of CRISPR-Cas9 and making sure that they understand the intricacies of the endoplasmic reticulum of a cell. But we don't teach them about life in general. And the basic common sense of putting things together is really what's going to help us to take these technologies and have them evaluated from a common sense perspective and how they're going to make a difference. And I think that for the leaders of today, and especially for the leaders of tomorrow, we have to bring common sense back into our educational curriculum. It's desperately needed, and it's how this country is going to transform itself.
Suresh, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I really think that the education is a key. I had an opportunity to talk to the Mittal Foundation about a month ago, and I made this point that we have tremendous scientists here in India. We have tremendous role models, and what we need to do is to take that into the classroom from the first grade and to show kids, how do you think big? Vijay pointed out this morning that you have to think about global problems and important problems and so on. At least while I was going through school, I was never even allowed to ask a question of the professor, right, in college. Innovation and inquiry, puts people on the defensive rather than allowing you to ask the tough questions. And teachers and all of us here have a role, whether it's our children, our friends, whatever, to encourage those thought-provoking questions. And even if you don't have the answer, you can connect the dots and there's always Google Auntie there to help you out. You can go find the answer for these questions. So this is very important. I want to also just quickly focus for a minute on 3 or 4 areas. One is, it is very important that we allow the basic science to take place, but basic science means, as Vijay pointed out, asking the relevant questions, not the incremental questions. The relevant questions really mean that, is this an important question to get an answer to? Second, we must encourage risk-taking. Third is we have to create ecosystems. Despite this technology that I talked about today, if we don't have the little companies, the experimenters and so on, the whole ecosystem that takes things from a human genome that costs billions of dollars to produce and now can be done at less than $1,000, without that sustaining ecosystem, this would not be possible. We need to create that in India. And finally, I think we need to have a longer-term view, which I think the government is now beginning to play an important role in to sustain these things. And I just go back for a minute to the biotech revolution or any other, whether it's AI or virtual reality or augmented reality, all of these will take a couple of decades to mature. And if we don't sustain it along the way, we run into the risk of killing it too soon. So I want to encourage all of you to think broadly in this, on this education aspect, and see how we can encourage and sustain these technologies until they come to fruition, which might take 10 or 20 or 30 years, but that's what it takes to make disruptive changes, transform society.
So I think also with Suresh, I think your point is really well made. I think another thing that we can incorporate that's a really exciting new thing happening in this country is the emergence of citizen science and actually getting citizens and especially children involved in gathering data. I think this gets them involved in the scientific process very early on and gives them an opportunity to be part of the discovery process. And I think that's very much needed in agriculture, right, where we need a lot of background information on things like soil chemistry, and that's very hard to get, but could be done by involving the communities more. So I also think this would be something really good and may help with a lot of the things you're discussing.
So with this, I think I have 6 minutes left. Arun, I'm not going to take more time, but I have time for 2 questions. If you ask precise questions, we will give you precise answers. If you don't ask precise questions, I'll interrupt and stop you and give chance to someone else. Right? So you, and then you, and then, okay.
Well, a good session. My name is K.C. Bansal. I'm a professor of plant biotechnology. By the way, I'm from Harvard. You know what? This has been very well said. It's a great discussion. And we also know that, yes, we need to increase productivity. To increase more food and agriculture, one of the priority areas mentioned in the morning as well. Professor VijayRaghavan very clearly mentioned innovative solutions to the science and technology. And you know what? There is a study already made to increase the productivity. What is more important? You've got management practices, fertilizers, et cetera, 77% is going to be only through genetic gains. Through increasing this technology, whatever we talk about it. Classical plant breeding can play a role, but in certain crops it cannot. It has been proven by science, we know about it. So, but therefore, and again, this is, science is all universal. So, but then there's a problem in our own country, then we have this universality of the science, whether you talk of GM crops or you talk of CRISPR-Cas, it's very well proven, there's no doubt about it. Even if there are certain other viewpoints as well, could be taken care of, as Amitabh very clearly mentioned. So, the point is here, an institution like, the Lakshmi Mittal Family South Asia Institute can play a big role through this meeting. I'm happy to see this kind of a meeting here.
Sir, your precise question.
No, my precise question is therefore, can we try to have a kind of a NITI or a policy, for certain crops and certain traits, for certain agroecological regions, targeted crops and traits, keeping climate change in view in India, to this kind of a discussion and a kind of a paper to be prepared as an action plan, it's really speaking to move forward. And the players are here, and I'm sure, we can all make a difference on this.
And your question, sir.
I just have two precise questions.
Sir, one.
Yeah, one? Okay. See, India is very strong in information technology, and mobiles is being used by a lot of people. So how do we transfer this information and knowledge from scientific laboratories to our small and marginal farmers using the strength available today in India? Everybody has a mobile, including the farmers. So what do you feel the way in which we can implement it, strategize this knowledge to reach, transfer to the people, the target, which is small and marginal farmers, which is 90%?
If I could take a quick crack at that answer. So, if you ask scientists, there are certain things I as a scientist want to push down. It's not clear that the other side wants to hear that. So, I would really ask, what is it that the farmers want? What are the key things that they're concerned about? Collect that and then have scientists address those so that it's more useful for them and that therefore it'll sustain itself. And Amitabh, you may have comments on this.
I think the startup ecosystem can play a big role. So I think the biggest challenge has been the last mile connectivity, and that's not possible from the top, right? So having the startups working on the ground level with the farmers, looking, as Professor Subramani said, looking at their needs, and it has to be like, the thinking has to be think global, act local, right? That's the only way we can solve the problem. And yeah, we have a great opportunity. Like now we have hundreds of millions of cell phone users, and a lot of the, I was reading an article yesterday that more than 300 million of them are using data. So if you have apps which are not descriptive, but maybe icon based, yeah, it could disrupt.
So the apps exist as well. I mean, we're hearing about in the current elections, the issues with WhatsApp, right? And like how that's being used and misused to disseminate information. But that's also a powerful tool to allow farmers to work together, to relay information. And there are startups, I know some in Bangalore, that are actually trying to utilize this sort of technology to allow farmers to interact. And to your point, sir, about policies, I don't want more policies. Let's please not have more policies in this country. We've got so many of them, and a lot of them even interact improperly with each other, I can say. Let's have more action. So let's actually have the people take the policies and actually do something with them. Get more data, test out genetically modified crops, understand the effect they're having on the country, increase our education, increase the curriculum, but no
Sir,
more policies.
You can catch up during the lunch. Sir, one question, last 15 seconds.
My concern is about, recently we had a green revolution for so many years, and because of that green revolution we use so much chemical fertilizer and pesticide. If you go to Punjab, which is a highly productive area, one district whole is suffering from a cancer because of pollution. So let us try to focus this way, what are the outcomes of this, how to deal this type of problem.
So your question is, how can new technology help in detoxifying what we have done? Yeah.
So, there are ways of now breeding plants for insect resistance or herbicide resistance, but also one can use technologies that we talk about to modify insect pests. 40% of agriculture around the world is lost due to pests and disease and so on. All of these technologies can address those to make plants more resistant to these pests.
Any question from student, researcher community, youngster, anybody under 30 wants to ask a specific question? Please, because you will ask question, I know. Yes, last, and then we close.
Hi, I'm under 31. I work with an NGO. I'm not a student. we've reached out so far to close to 13,000 farmers, and we have given them climate resilient seeds, etc. But coming to the point, the other side of one of the things our farmers are struggling with is access to water and water conservation. So can you throw some light on how we can address that, because that's a very important factor to consider.
Yeah, this sustainability of agriculture is important issue, and there are ways, there are technology available which can help you with water conservation, And I think there is also a need to have the cultural practices change. For example, we talked about the use of water for rice. Actually, in rice, water is used as a weedicide, right? You flood it so that you don't want others to grow, only rice to grow, right? And there has been some work that is going on where there is a decisive shift towards direct seeded rice. So if you can move away from paddy, I'm not saying this is applicable everywhere, wherever it is possible, that will have huge impact on water conservation. Having said that, there are literature report you could see, coming also from our organization, where we have edited plants which leads to higher yield under drought condition. So it is possible.
Thank you, Amitabh, and that's end to this panel. Please give my panel big hand for this interesting discussion. And I'm pleased to invite the next panel before I leave this place. Professor Venkatesh Murthy, Professor and Chair